Chapter 14. It had been nearly 2 years since leaving Roxbury. Frequently I fantasized about a return to Roxbury. Not a permanent return, just a chance to see Mother, Abigail, and even my brother Micah. Would these people that I left behind even know me? Not that my appearance was much different. My brown hair was now long and braided in the style of my Wyandotte brothers. Patches of hair grew on a poorly groomed face. But would they see other changes by looking into my hardened brown eyes? I left Roxbury a boy. Luck allowed for survival those first days in the woods after my escape. Survival no longer depended on luck. The vast knowledge gained through my time with the Wyandotte and French companions had transformed me into a self-sufficient man. A smile came to my lips as I remembered how important the meaning of our names had been to my mother. Spending time in the woods as a boy had given me a sense of pride because of that knowledge. How naive it had been to think I understood the forest then. What would Mother think of her son now? The son who had become what Mother had taught in innocent childhood lessons. A son that had become what he was destined to be. A man of the woods, as my name stood for. We traveled south at a slow pace due to intentional caution. We were very concerned about having any kind of contact with the tribes of the Seneca. Many stories have been told to my companions about their hatred of the French. They were likely the ones that had destroyed the mission. Once we passed through this territory, based on our trip the previous year, we were confident safe conditions would await us. There had been little evidence of an Indian presence when we had reached the mountain region. The experience we had in the mountains mirrored that of the first trip early on. We saw some of the most beautiful scenery any of us could recall ever encountering. One day, early in the summer, we came into a clearing in the middle of the mountains that was filled with large rocks. It was the most majestic sight any of us had ever seen. It was a field of large rocks as wide as a river and at least as long as a village. There were no trees in the field. We skipped from rock to rock, marveling at the piled field of stones. The various pelts were plentiful in the mountain ponds and streams. We continued moving south for the next few weeks, traveling west away from the higher peaks and into the foothills area. We sometimes followed rivers for long distances into the mountains or hills until we came to a place narrow enough to pass. The weather became extremely warm for a stretch in midsummer. We headed east, hoping to find a cooler climate in the mountains. It was on this trek that we accidentally came into contact with a band of Susquehannock Indians. Great care was taken to avoid contact with all Indians. The presence of groups in an area was usually discovered through signs we detected early, so avoidance was usually easy. But while following a stream in a hilly region one day, we approached a large waterfall. Anxious to drink and bathe in the cool water, we moved excitedly toward the base of the waterfall. The sound of the flowing water was just loud enough to allow us to walk right into the midst of a hunting party with a dozen braves. A few bathed in the large pool at the base of the cascading water. Many were already staring at us as we entered the clearing. None made a move. They only stared at us curiously. Jean-Luc, whom both Claude and I looked to as our leader, was the first to speak. Tribes of the Northeast spoke many different dialects of the Iroquoian language. The conversation that took place was surprisingly easy for me to follow. Most of the words were recognizable. It was impressive to see Jean-Luc navigate his way through the conversation with relative ease. At first, Jean-Luc was asking many questions to gain information. Eventually, he began telling them the story of the mission and the difficult winter he had there. Luckily, the Susquehannock were a tribe that was not hostile to Europeans like us. Jean-Luc even managed to exchange some of our furs for much-needed supplies before we were allowed to pass. That evening, after setting up camp, we discussed the information they had shared. The Susquehannock and the southern Lenape clans shared the territory we were traveling in. The Susquehannock and the Haudenosaunee were bitter enemies and frequently raided one another. The Lenape tribes had moved west after conflict with the Eastern English and Dutch settlers. The Lenape hated these settlers for stealing their land. There were rumors that some of the Lenape took the Eastern white men prisoner and traveled south to trade them to the Spanish. The Spanish were said to offer huge rewards for English settlers. Jean-Luc seemed to think because Claude and I had stayed silent, the Indians we encountered believed us all to be French. As we settled on our beaver fur blankets to sleep that night, Jean-Luc and Claude continued to speak quietly as I drifted off. 3 days later, we began to suspect we were being followed. The forest did not sound right. After some debate, we decided to do a large circle with the intention of crossing our own path to look for evidence of pursuit. Before we had a chance to complete this plan, we were confronted by a group of Indians that looked different from the group seen days before. It was immediately clear that this band had different intentions. Their weapons were drawn and their glares displayed fierceness. They were dressed as warriors and were covered in bright-colored paints. Their skin was darker than the others we had interacted with. Many wore arm and leg bands made of what appeared to be silver and gold. Jean-Luc instructed Claude and I to place our weapons on the ground. A moment's hesitation served only to confirm that we were surrounded. Jean-Luc spoke to 2 of the Indians. Only later it was clarified that they were Southern Lenape. Both he and the Indians spoke more slowly than the conversation a few days before. There were fewer recognizable words. After a few minutes without turning to face us, Jean-Luc instructed Claude and me to introduce ourselves and tell where we came from. The conversation between Jean-Luc and the leader of the group continued again after we had both spoken. Eventually, I felt relieved to see Jean-Luc and the warriors he spoke with all nod and come to some sort of an agreement. But as Jean-Luc turned around, it was clear something had gone wrong. His face was pale. His expression as he looked at me seemed to display a mixture of horror and apology. I glanced to Claude, who stood at my side. He was staring at the ground and refused to look up or even speak when I murmured, "Claude?" Jean-Luc approached in 3 slow strides. He interrupted as I attempted to question what was happening. "Silas, these are Lenape Indians of the Turkey clan. You must go with them now. They intend to take you far south. There are men there that are trading generously for English prisoners. I am sorry." His eyes showed that he was sincere. Anger rose from deep inside as my temple throbbed at the recognition of betrayal. Their hushed tones at the fire days earlier now made sense. They had realized this possibility existed, and they had planned for it. Both men gathered their weapons without making further eye contact and walked to the north without looking back. The words he spoke were eerily familiar to those Father had spoken years before on the day I was taken prisoner in Roxbury. A feeling of wonder rushed in, bringing the question of whether God was punishing me for those past sins.